As I read through the stories in No Lie Like Love, I was immediately arrested by both the prose style and the themes that were chosen. Pages and pages dedicated to dialogue about nothing particularly lofty, whole stories cataloging the weekly schedule of an aging father, or stories which promise dramatic climaxes but subvert that promise with endings that disappear like a highway reaching off into one of many American West deserts. Paul Rawlins is a writer who is particularly unabashed to tell us about plain lives in quiet crisis. Lives which, written out in Paul's straightforward prose, are radiant with what I would call laughter, a laughter which seems to be part suffering and part joy. Again and again, the innocent in Paul's stories gain hard life experience, and if the stories don't offer a return road to innocence, they're at least full of longing, which is its own kind of innocence. Paul's a gifted teller of stories, but also one of the best listeners I've ever read. Someone who hears the story underneath the story and is able to retell both, one written out in his lines and one written between them. Paul Rawlins graduated from Brigham Young University with a BA in 1989 and an MA in 1992. His short stories have appeared in Glimmer Train, Epic, Southeast Review, Tampa Review, and Prism, among others, and have been anthologized in Where Love is Found, Dispensation, and Listening to the Voices. His nonfiction includes articles for Business, Genealogy, and other magazines. Rawlins' first collection of short stories, No Lie Like Love, won the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction, and he currently lives in Salt Lake City. Paul Rawlins.
That was very kind, thank you. Excuse me. Going back and forth on what to read today, and I think I'll read something fairly new. And I had a good friend of mine who was my reader for years, who passed away about a year and a half ago last summer. So, and this is, I think, the last piece that she read that I had published. So, Val, I hope you approve. This is called The Corn God. I think I'll leave this open. Two weeks after the army sent my father to Afghanistan, my mother drove me to my grandparents' farm, explaining that she had to find a new job now that our daddy was gone, and promising she would come back for me soon. She gave me a huge abrazo, reached down to pinch my bum, which was a habit of hers, and then left me, telling my grandmother no, she couldn't stay for dinner, my grandmother saying nonsense, it was a long way she had come. I have to go, she said in her Samba accent. These were my father's parents, and I think we both felt like strangers there without him. Or maybe she thought my grandfather's eyes lingered on her a little too long, like men's eyes always did. Or maybe, as things turned out, she just had a plane to catch. I'd worked up a heart full of venom for the farm on the drive up, knowing I would be left there alone. We had visited every July when I was little. For a week I would drink thick whole milk, eat homemade scones and mounds of my grandmother's pickles, tag behind my grandfather on his chores, and chase cats around the barn, and cry when we finally had to go back home. We hadn't been back now for a couple of summers, since my father changed jobs and had little vacation time. My mother didn't really like the farm, would never have gone there with just the two of us. I cared less about it myself as I grew into bikes and rollerblades, sleepovers, and morning crafts classes under the pavilion at the park with two other girls who had just moved in on the next block. And my grandmother, we knew, was in the early stages of dementia. But while I stood in the driveway, staring at the skinny white house, taller than it was wide, and standing in a swamp from the water turned out of a ditch that ran alongside the road, the fields of tall corn and drying windrows of green and blonde alfalfa waiting for the sun and the baler, my hate cowered and left me only desperation. My grandfather came down from the porch while my mother drove off, tooting the horn and waving at me out the window over the top of the car. My grandmother had wandered across the lawn and was staring up into the crabapple tree with her hands held behind her back, the irrigation water covering the tops of her shoes. "We put you in the upstairs room," Grandpa said, which was where my mother and Dad had always stayed, while I slept downstairs on the fold-out couch. "These all your things?" I nodded, and he reached down for my suitcase and the overstuffed backpack leaning against my leg while I stood hugging my pillow in my arms. My grandfather looked at it. "We got pillows," he said. "She knows that." Then he took my bags and headed up the cement steps into the house. "Mom," I whispered. The word came out of mist, a trace of vapor that floated up toward the electric wires, where it broke into its tiny pieces and scattered on the air. Nobody bothered me in the bedroom. Nobody came upstairs at all. It was a loft room, and the outside wall came up maybe 3 feet high where it met the pitch of the roof, with a window at each triangle end, one to the west, one to the east. A sagging twin bed, a chest of drawers, a little table with a lamp, a little chair that had once been painted a minty green with a picture of a large-eyed puppy on the backrest. These were on the east end of the room. Along the walls were boxes, 2 old Samsonite suitcases, a trunk. The suitcases, I would discover later, were empty except for an old wheat-backed penny and a safety pin I found when I turned out the sock ruffle in one of them. The trunk held clothes from when my grandfather had been in the army, old and permanently creased. I would take them out, the shirts, the pants, the tie, the little pup tent cap, and lay them around me carefully on the floor, unpacking the trunk until I reached the bottom, then running my hands along the edges and into the corners for anything I'd missed, every time thinking there ought to be something more, a letter, a photograph, a bullet, a ribboned medal. "Were you in the war, Grandpa?" I asked him on my third night while we each sat in our own chair in the living room. I was so lonely. Worse, I was very bored. "No," he said. "He was a sailor," my grandmother piped in. "That was Dennis," he told her, an uncle. "Dennis was in the Navy. He sent me that little hula girl there on the shelf from Borneo," she said, pointing until I looked. "He never left North Island," my grandfather said, as he got up and walked through the kitchen on his way outside. That came from Disneyland. My grandfather would come in several times a day to check the stove and the taps, and he had installed a door at the top of the stairwell to the basement that he kept locked. He stocked the cupboard with extra bread and cans of potted meat, easy dinner fixings, because Grandma cooked sometimes with handfuls of salt or soda, or she might set a pot of vegetables on for soup and neglect to add the water or light the burners on the stove. He locked up the cleaning chemicals and his gun, and they stayed away from church most Sundays because my grandmother might refuse the sacrament bread, complaining out loud that it was only crumbs, or I heard once stand up and start taking off her blouse. Sometimes she knew me. Sometimes she thought I was one of her sisters. Sometimes I was just a stranger she asked my grandfather to make go away. It was Nancy, the neighbor who lived on the opposite side of the mile-square block, who arranged school for me. Whether my grandfather had asked her, or she, with a mother's knack, simply sized up the situation and took things in hand, I was registered and added to the bus route at the end of August. Back home, I had already been in middle school for a year. Here, as a 7th grader, I would be back on the bottom rung again, and the new girl besides. It didn't matter. I couldn't wait to go. I don't remember if I noticed the girl with a fat ponytail of auburn hair when she got on the bus 2 stops after I did that first morning. Grandma had left me flustered by calling me Nora, her sister, when I came downstairs and warning me not to wear her blue dress. But I had 2 classes with her that day, pre-algebra and PE, and on her way off the bus that afternoon, she gave me a little finger wave and said, "Don't forget your hygiene form." She pulled a face that made me smile, then said to save her a seat tomorrow morning. In that instant, when Steph Saunders said hello, life was better. Liesl rode the bus too. We had English together and pre-algebra with Steph. Missy had home ec, drama, and a dance class 2 nights a week with Liesl, and she knew Steph from a half a dozen other places their paths had crossed growing up in the same rural valley. Within 2 weeks, I was part of a new quartet. We made our first trip to my house after school, mostly because no one had seen inside it before. Not that it was anything spectacular, but it was someplace new at least, and they envied my room. Steph and Liesl both had to share with sisters, and nobody else had her own room on the 2nd floor with a pitched ceiling and a window at each end. Missy peered out the east one and said, "You ought to put a window box right here. They have them at Smithfield Implement. We could paint it blue with sunflowers on it." Missy had a thing for sunflowers that fall. "It's too late now," Liesl said, coming over beside her and leaning down to see. "We'll get some artificial ones," Missy said, measuring the width of the sill with her hands. "That way Deeds can change them anytime, whenever she wants something new." That was the first time anybody had called me Deeds, and I liked it. I waited to see if Steph or Liesl would take it up. I'd had nicknames back home, but nobody wants to be called Deedlebug in junior high. I was always Deeds after that, which I counted as more good fortune, and my house became our hub. In my attic room in Grandpa's fields, nobody paid us much attention, and that was perfect for a private 4-girls world. Except for a freeze in September that blackened the squash leaves and ended the tomatoes, the fall was warm, and most days after we went inside and found a snack, we wandered down the road that bordered the cornfield. About half a mile down from the barn, it made a T to follow the fence line of the neighbor's pasture, and the land began to slope at the top of a hill that tumbled down to the sloughs along the river bottoms. Down the slope, just far enough to be hidden from the house, we'd tromp nests into the long, sallow grass underneath the spread of the Russian olives, where we could lie out of the wind with our faces toward the westing sun, and talk about secret or forbidden subjects. Boys and the specifics of sex as best we knew them, diet pills and meth, the girls at school or church. I mostly listened. I was young for my grade. I didn't worry about boys at school. I didn't even know. I worried about my dad and wondered about my mom. I would drift along at the edge of their daydreams until they insisted that I tell them something. Then I would make up lies about my life back home, full of rich friends, and danger. The best lies, the most extravagant, I told about my mother. She's a model, I said. They had seen her picture, and none of them doubted me. Or she was, before she met my dad. How did they meet, Liesel said. I took a little more risk here. Do you want to know the real story, I said. The real story was my mother had come to be a nanny for a family whose son had been a missionary in Brazil and met my father on a blind date where he tried to show off with his high school Spanish. But they were all listening now. Liesel had looked up from where she was braiding Missy's hair. Steph leaned back on her elbows, and Missy sat cross-legged with her arms wrapped around her knees. My dad was down in South America with the Army. He was doing what they call black ops, secret stuff. They were hunting down this big drug guy. I was improvising as I went, but the pieces just seemed to appear and slide into place as I kept talking. I don't even know what country it was, I said. He can't ever say, and nobody knew they were there, but they were looking for this guy in the jungle. They found his camp, and there was a firefight. He wasn't there. He'd found out they were coming, but he left a bunch of other guys behind to guard the cocaine. It was all sounding good. Anyway, you know how they're always kidnapping people down there and holding them for ransom? That's what happened to my mom. After the army guys had taken over the camp, they were setting fire to the place, and they found 3 hostages in one of the huts, and one of them was my mom. Really, Missy said. I nodded. She was only 15, but my dad told her before he left that he'd come back and marry her when she was 18, and that's what he did. I told him that's where Mom was now. She'd gone back to be in a soap opera. The drug lord who had kidnapped her was dead, so it was safe. She'd be down there until they finished filming the season, and then she'd come get me. Dad was over on secret missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, but when he got back from the war, we might all move to Brazil. Do you speak Spanish? Missy said. They don't speak Spanish there, I said. They speak Portuguese. Does she call you? Missy asked. She didn't. She hadn't called at all. Not very often, I said. I started to choke up. She's busy. When is she coming back? I don't know for sure. We all sat quiet until Steph stood and brushed the slivers of grass off her jeans. We'll ask the corn god, she said. The west end of the field had once been a sand hill where my grandfather said corn used to grow as tall as a man on a saddle horse. On the west side of the road that bordered the field stood a dozen volunteer stalks in a staggered row that escaped the combine, the only things left standing in the field. The middle 2 stood tallest, topped with tufted crowns that looked like dipping heads of wheat, their leaves tattered into pennants of parchment, thin fingers that lifted up to point the direction of the wind. The stalks, desiccated canes with the outer skin stripped away, fit together like sections of pipe. A few ears still stood erect and sheathed in their husks against the stalk, but most of the remaining ears hung down, dry, rough-edged cobs with flaky, empty sockets and a few golden kernels at the tip, knobby and smooth. Most of the yellow had faded out of the leaves and stalks like a sun bled of heat, but they were not quite white. One of the stalks was bent, fractured at a 90-degree angle, and barred across another like a pointing or broken arm, and they rattled with the wind, even when we couldn't hear the breeze that moved them. Liesel said the row reminded her of chess pieces, the queen in the middle and the king a little higher at her left, both taller than any of us. It was Steph who turned the line of stalks into an altar, or a deity. It's the corn god, she'd said after we had finished naming the chess pieces. That's not nice, Missy told her. It's God with a little g, Steph said, like they have in Africa. Since when were you in Africa? Steph sighed. I just mean that primitive people, like in Africa, worship the earth and the sun and trees and things like that. Why would you want to worship feed corn, Liesel said. You can't even eat it. The corn's just a symbol, Steph said. Then she'd knelt in front of the row of stalks, spread out her arms in a huge Y, and bowed her head. Oh, great corn god, she said. Missy sniggered. Ignore her, Steph said. Show mercy to the non-believers or smite them as you will. Don't say that, Missy told her. Stop laughing, Steph hissed over her shoulder. I wasn't. You were. Well, I've stopped. Don't say that anymore. Steph turned back toward the row of stalks. Great corn god, she said, giver of the harvest, hear me, your daughter. With your ears, Liesel mouthed to me. I put both my hands to my face and stumbled into the field, trying to make my laughter sound like a cough. Steph must have looked up back again because I could hear Liesl saying, "Keep going." "Hear me," Steph said. I broke out laughing just as Liesl chanted out loud this time, "With your ears." Everybody was laughing now. Steph stayed on her knees, looking at us over her shoulder and trying to keep a straight face. Finally, she got up and found 2 old cobs. "Hear me with your ears," she said, shaking them over her head. "Now can I finish?" Liesl nodded, grinning. She had one hand on her hip, a leg thrust out to the side, a dancer's pose, her body long and taut. Missy stood with her arms wrapped tight across her front, biting at her thumbnail. This time, Steph leaned forward and touched the ears to the ground in front of her. "Great corn god, giver of gifts, hear your daughter," she said, "and let Tyler Pond ask me to the winter formal." She paused like she was thinking what else to say and then added, "Amen." She got up, brushed off her knees, and handed the cobs to Liesl. Steph might get asked to the winter formal at the high school if Tyler Pond, who was a sophomore, dared ask a 7th grader. Steph was pretty, with her dark red-brown hair and clear skin. Steph didn't look 13. "Your parents wouldn't let you go," Liesl said, drumming the air in front of her with a pair of cobs, "and the high school wouldn't let a 7th grader go to winter formal anyway." "I didn't say I would go," Steph said. "I just want him to ask me." "So go on." Steph nodded toward the row of stocks. Liesl bent down and asked for a good grade on her next math test. Missy declined, shaking her head while she bit her thumb and saying she couldn't think of anything. I had shrugged, taken the cobs, and asked the corn god to keep my dad safe. Tyler had not asked Steph to the winter formal, not yet, but he did call her one night. Liesl had gotten a B. I got a call from Dad telling me not to worry. He had left messages everywhere for Mom, and they'd have everything worked out soon. So when Steph handed me the corns after I told them my story, I took them, knelt, and asked when my mom was coming home. Liesl had another math test coming up. Steph wanted a new pair of jeans that cost $90. Missy said she was still thinking. Our petitions didn't take very long, and it wasn't as funny this time. "You should probably leave something when you ask for something," Steph said. "Leave what?" "A sacrifice. Like when they throw virgins into volcanoes. People in the old days would kill a sheep or burn something on the altar," Steph explained. "We can't start a fire out here," I said. "You bring gifts. That makes the god happy, and then you get what you want. Otherwise, the god gets angry and wipes everybody out with a drought or a plague." "What sort of gifts?" Liesl said. Steph shrugged. "Food, something you like. You always have to give up something to get something." She thought for a moment. "And if you don't, the corn won't grow." "I don't care if the corn grows," Missy said, though I thought my grandfather might. "If the corn doesn't grow, nothing grows." "That's stupid." "No, it's not. Corn is the sign of life. It comes from the sun and the earth and the water, and then the animals eat it and it gives them life, and then we drink the milk and eat the animals and it gives us life." "Sounds like biology class," Liesl said. "All right, if the corn doesn't grow, it means you won't grow either," Steph said. Next time we agreed, we'd all bring an offering. I got a card that week from Mom. It had foreign stamps on it and no return address, but she said she loved me and she'd see me soon. I put the card in my jacket pocket and walked out in the field until I stood looking at the row of stalks. Their fingers lifted to point at me in the wind that was blowing in my face and toying with my hair, which had grown long and shaggy. Nancy had offered to trim my bangs, but most days I just pulled it back in a ponytail and let it be. It was loose now, shifting and falling with the gusts, and I squinted against the bits of dust the breeze kicked up. The corn gods seemed to be looking back at me, waiting for me to speak. The crowns on the tall stalks nodded, the knights rustled in conference, the broken arm on the queen's bishop clacking like a door, banging open and shut on a hinge. I lifted a hand in greeting, then let it fall. I didn't come any closer, just stood watching until I saw something shiny at the foot of the queen. I brushed my hair back, then walked forward and knelt down to look. It was a muffin. It had been wrapped in foil, but the silver had been carefully folded back and curled like petals. There was a candle, too, with a little silver necklace wrapped around it. The wick was black, but there was only a tiny dimple in the wax beneath it, so it hadn't burned for very long. The muffin was banana walnut, Missy's favorite. You had to give up something you wanted, Steph had said. I picked up the candle and turned it in my fingers. Then I saw the rock that had been laid there. Under it was a piece of paper, and on the paper was Missy's wish, her prayer. I unfolded the note and read it, but Nancy had already told me how Missy's mom had found a lump in her breast and had to go into Logan for tests. I folded the paper and tucked it back under the rock, then stood and held up my mother's card to show the stalks. Soon. She hadn't said when exactly, but she had said soon. Missy was first up every week after that, with a muffin and a candle. Liesl would raise her eyebrows and lick her lips behind Missy's back, where I could see her, though Missy would never say what she wanted out loud. "You can tell," Liesl said finally. "It's not like a wish." "He knows," Missy said, getting up from the ground. Liesl hauled out her math book. "Not even," Steph said. "You can't leave that out here," Missy said, wiping her nose with one of the wads of Kleenex she kept stuffed in her coat pockets. "I figured that way he could read up a little bit." Liesl tipped her head toward the corn god. "And maybe I'd get an A next time." I laughed. Missy insisted she couldn't leave the book. Liesl said it would only be for overnight, but she shoved the book back into her bag and pulled out a tube of lip gloss. Steph shook her head. "No good," she said, "unless you want someone to kiss you." Liesl thought a minute, shrugged, and stuck the tube into the ground. Steph had brought a little stuffed bear. "What's that got to do with jeans, or is his name Tyler?" Liesl said. Steph pointed to the tiny blue shorts it was wearing. "I don't know why, but I had taken the little hula dancer from my grandma's shelf. I could come back later and get it. What I always asked for now was the only thing I had wanted since I had gotten the card. I wanted soon to be now. I prayed for my mother to come and take me home." When I stepped up for my turn, Steph said from behind me, "Where's your mom, really?" I didn't turn around. Something had been funny for almost a week now. It felt like Steph had taken a step away from me. She was there, just like she had been since the second day of school, but it was like she was watching instead of being with me. First Steph, and then Liesl and Missy. "South America," I said. "That's a whole continent," Liesl pointed out, while she rubbed the tops of her folded arms with her hands. "Your mother's not a model," Steph said. I took a long breath. "She was. She's not an actress, and your dad's only a supply sergeant." "He is now," I said feebly. "That's all he's ever been," Steph said. "My uncle's in his unit." I stood holding the little hula girl in front of me, thumbing her skirt. "Why did you lie to us?" Liesl said. "I didn't," I tried. "Stop lying." Missy had been quiet for a couple of weeks, and she had started to cry over everything. Now she sounded angry. I turned to face them, casting around for something to say. I put a hand in my pocket, found my mother's card, and squeezed it in my fist. "Why'd she leave you?" Steph said. "She went to get a job." "But why'd she have to leave you here?" I didn't know why. "I'm sorry," I said. "Why should we believe you now?" Missy said. "True," Steph agreed. I stood with the three of them in an arc in front of me, waiting until Steph said, "We'll fix it. Come here." She squatted to tug a piece of orange baling twine from the dirt and told me to hold out my hands. I set the hula dancer down, and she wrapped the twine around my wrists, tying it in a triple knot on top. "A little dolly's not going to do it. You'll have to be the corn god's bride." She waved an arm in front of the stalks. "We'll need to make a bed here," she said. Missy and Liesl went to work, gathering together bunches of grass and laying them out on the ground. Steph had swept with her foot. I was crying. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't tell me," Steph said. She tipped her head toward the line of stalks. "You need to tell him." While Missy finished straightening out the grass nest, Steph said they needed to do my feet, and Liesl tied the laces of my shoes together. "Lie down here," Steph said. "I didn't lie to the corn god," I said, kneeling down, then dropping onto my rump on the frozen grass. "How do we know?" Missy said. She looked over to Steph and Liesl. "What should she have to do? Maybe she should stay here all night." "Someone would have to stay here to make sure," Liesl said. "We wouldn't have to do that, would we, Deeds?" Steph said. "Not on your wedding night." Liesl giggled. I shook my head. No, they wouldn't have to. No, they couldn't leave me here all night. Just no. They stood around me in a half circle, chewing at their lips, scrunching up their foreheads to think. The sun was almost gone, and from my back I could see the night sky's first cold star. "I know," Steph said. She searched for a good-sized ear and snapped it off a stalk. She came back and stood at my feet, peeling back the husk and exposing the cob. Missy stood in front of the king, the hood from her coat pulled up, biting her thumb. "What's that for?" Liesl said. "For the sacrifice." Liesl made a chopping motion with her arm, her fist closed, as if she were plunging a knife. Then she started to chant, "Anya, Anya, Anya, Anya." I had already worked my lashed together shoes off the heels, and I rolled to my knees and up on my feet, biting at the orange twine that tasted of waxy plastic and dirt as I stumbled away. "She went to get a job," I said, spitting grit from my mouth. "She's coming back." "Not now," Steph said, shaking her head and waggling the corn cob at me. I worked the card out of my pocket with my tied hands and shook it at them, backing into the field, feeling the corn stubble jab into my feet. She already told me, I said. She said soon. That was before. Now the corn god's going to be angry. You probably sent that card to yourself, Missy said. You asked about your mom, too, I reminded her. Her face clouded. But she didn't offend the corn god, Steph said. The corn god will listen to her. I shook the card. She already said, I'd hate to be your grandpa next spring. The corn's going to be about this high. Steph tipped to one side and held a hand to her knee, if it even sprouts. Well, I saw you and Tyler, I yelled at Steph. I was panting now. I was over at Nancy's. You were out back. You were behind the trampoline. Steph stood with her mouth hung open. Liar, she said. He was, everything you say is a lie. Steph threw the cob at me. No wonder the corn god hates you. I don't care, I cried, tripping over the stump-littered ground while I backed away. I come out at night and pee on it. Missy hurled a cob at me with murder in her face. Liesl stared at her while Steph found another. Go on then, Steph said, chucking the cob, and don't be surprised what happens. I saw you, I tried again. More ears landed around me, and I scrambled across the field for the road. I could hear them arguing behind me after the cob stopped. Steph shouting, you think I care? And then Liesl yelling from the end of the field while I ran in my stocking feet along the flat rise in between the two ruts that made the road, the sharp breeze snapping at my face and ears. It was a game, Deeds. From my upstairs window, I imagined I could just make out his crown, the shadow of the wheat-tadded tassels at the tops of the tallest stalks. I couldn't remember a moon so bright. You could see the road through the field, the cows bedded down in the mouth of the hay shed in the corral, the dark pole of an old derrick like a long gallows, and far to the west, the dim white luminescence, a science word that week, resting on the corn god. He would kill my father in the war and keep my mother, ruin my grandpa's farm. Or if the corn god wouldn't, the real god would for bowing down in front of the stalks. Maybe it had happened already, with Missy's mom and now with Grandma. Nancy had been at the house waiting for me when I got home, shoeless and bawling. After she'd calmed me down, made me wash my face, and got me into my slippers, she told me that my grandfather had run Grandma into Logan to the doctor. She wouldn't tell me exactly what had happened. She said it would be all right, but I didn't think she sounded sure. I stood shivering at my windowsill, cold from the inside out, my mind churning, until finally I felt my way down the dark stairs, running my hand along the wall, feeling over the edge of each step with my foot for the next one. I turned the knob on the hall closet slowly, pushing against the door with my other hand because it shut tight and sprang when it opened. I reached down my coat, slid my arms into the sleeves, and left the door ajar as I headed for the kitchen. Dee Dee? I hadn't seen my grandfather sitting in the corner at the kitchen table. I shook when he spoke, terrified and struck dumb until I knew the voice was his. It's the middle of the night, he said, a shadow in the corner. What you got your coat on? What you got your coat on for? I was cold. Where's Grandma? He didn't answer. Nancy was here, I said. She made me supper. She was just going to go check on her boys. I like Nancy. I didn't want to get her in trouble. She was here when I got back. We thought you were asleep. Where's Grandma? I said. They kept her at the hospital. What happened? She was cooking dinner at the stove. Was it bad? I said. No, he told me. I would learn the details later. How she had said to him, Earl, look, and held out her nightie from the sides, watching the flames twirling up around the hem, snaking their way up toward her waist. He stood and walked to the sink. I went to the wall, found the switch, and turned on the light. He pulled away from the brightness of the bulb. A day's beard made his face gray, and he wore a suit jacket on top of his overalls. He had the face of a sad-looking dog. Loose folds of skin hung down around his mouth, and the eyes were stunned. I didn't understand then how my grandfather was a disappointed man, how he had never gotten ahead as he had hoped to. His small herd of jerseys stayed small. His fields never expanded in the way he had dreamed, and he owed more and owned less now than he had when my father was my age. There had been a daughter, long dead from drugs, and a silly try at local politics that had left him looking like a fool. He had already borne 1,000 failures, large and small. Now his crazy wife had set herself on fire, and I knew why. He hurt her, I said, just like Missy's mom. Who? What's the matter with Missy's mom? I explained about the cancer, the lone stand of corn, and the prayer hid under the rock, the gifts Missy brought every week now. Next year I told him the crops won't grow. He won't let them. I was desperate by then, my body bent forward, every sinew, every pulse begging. And Mom won't come back. Dad will get hurt. Something in him stirred, and he seemed awake. Who said? He did. Who? The corn god, I told him. Bad things will happen. They said, don't be surprised. My grandfather looked down at me, his hands resting on the counter behind him. I had time for half a dozen panting breaths before he spoke. Out there? He pointed down the hall toward the back door. I nodded. He's out there now? I nodded yes again. Show me, he said. He handed me down a flashlight from the kitchen cupboard, then lifted his own coat from a peg by the back door. The night air bit at us as we stepped into it, trying to herd us back inside. The air, the crackle of the crisp grass as we walked, made the world seem brittle. At the barn, my grandfather took the flashlight and told me to wait. He went inside, and I listened to the low murmurs and shufflings of the cows around the corner, smelled their ammonia scent. They heard or sensed us there and began to stir and move our way. Shh, I told them, but it was comforting to know they were close. My grandfather came out with a round metal can, handed me the flashlight again, and walked toward the road. He seemed to know where we were going. I followed along in a rut in the frozen clay, still in my slippers. He spoke only once. Always frugal, he told me to turn off the flashlight, as the moon was bright enough that we didn't need it. Where the road made its T, I pointed to the north, and we came up to the file of stalks. I turned the light on them, scanning up and down their length, then panning over the ground in front of them. There were my shoes, the laces still in knots. A little half circle of cobs stood in the soil where the girls had apparently stuck them near the head of the grass bed after I had run. I hung back while my grandfather walked forward and stood a few steps in front of the row of corn. You girls been playing out here, he said. I nodded. This what done it? Brought your bad luck? Yes, I told him. I kept moving the light's beam up and down the row of stalks. In the dark, they seemed to rustle and whisper amongst themselves, then froze, morphing into plain dried leaves and stems when I trained the light on them. My grandfather brushed at the arc of buried cobs with the toe of his boot and looked at the nest of grass. Then he took something from his pocket and turned back toward me. He had a sickle in his hand. I didn't know what it was called then. I just saw the curve of the knife, the point at its end. It was only a crescent shadow in the dark, but I thought I could see its edge, honed down to the silver on the whetstone in the barn. I dropped the flashlight and ran. Dee Dee, he yelled. I dove into the cave made by the drooping arms of the Russian olives. He could have followed me if he'd wanted. There was nothing to stop him. But I rolled in the grass, wet and cold with frost, panting, then scrambled on my hands and knees over toward the fence, away from the opening, back from where he might think I was, and peeked out from the branches. He had picked up the flashlight and was scanning with it over where I had crawled under the tree. Dee Dee, the same impatient yell, loveless, bitter. He stood with the flashlight pointed at the tree, the sickle resting against his leg. I worked myself further down the hill until I felt the fence at my back. Dee Dee, he called again after a while. His voice had softened, not from compassion, not some sweet lure to bring me out in the open, but because he'd given up. Then he set the flashlight down on a can, walked over to the row of corn, and got down on a knee. He grasped the first stalk, the king's rook, a foot above the ground, swung the sickle, and chopped it from the roots. The rook, the knight, then the bishop on his way to the king. The sickle was dull, maybe, or the stalks were tough and fibrous, or my grandfather was tired, because some of them he beat at, slashing and chopping until they came away from the earth, and he laid them down behind him. He cut down the whole stand, kicking at the stumps. He cut down the whole stand, kicking at the stumps when he stood, pushing the leaves and stems together in a pile with his booted feet. Then he poured gasoline from the can over the pile, stepped back, and tossed a match he had pulled from his pocket and lit by scraping it beneath his thumbnail. The flames were instant, a poof of sound, and they appeared a magician's trick. He took a few steps back, then sat on the can to watch the orange pennants rise and then bend before a bit of breeze. I crawled out from under the trees while he sat there, hunched low to the ground, elbows on his knees. I came up to the fire from behind him, watched it for a moment, then gathered up a handful of cobs and flung them into the flames, one by one. My grandfather looked my way and nodded. I gathered every cob and leaf and stem I could find and hurled them in. I threw in pieces of orange baling twine, tufts of grass I jerked out of the ground. I threw in everything I could pick up that would burn, working my way around to the front of the fire where I found Missy's necklace. I squatted by it, flushed warm from the fire and my effort, and looked into the flames that had made quick work of the weeds and were already dying, curling into little dots of embers, as though in their hurry they had mistakenly consumed themselves. It was just a game. That's what Liesl had said. It was a game. But Liesl had only wagered on a math test. She's not coming back, I said out loud. I don't know, my grandfather replied. We were thinking our separate thoughts, each of our own losses. I scanned the ground for Grandma's little hula dancer, but it was gone, in the flames, or maybe one of the girls had taken it. I picked the necklace out of the dirt and laid it under a rock at the edge of the blackened circle of ashes. Then I turned to my grandfather, who handed me the sickle to carry, and picked up his gas can. He did not take my hand on the walk back to the house. This was not a movie or a play. We were not sudden friends or newly reconciled, but we were allies now at least. Nature makes an indifferent God, and the winter in the valley would be long and bleak because that's what winters were here. Grandma would come back after New Year's for a while. Liesl talked to me at school still sometimes, and in my prayers at night, kneeling on the old rag rug beside my bed, I dutifully remembered Missy's mom, who would have a double mastectomy and then start training to run marathons when I asked for my own. In the spring, I'd ride with my grandfather while he planted, sitting on the fender high above the giant turning wheel of the tractor, waiting for a card or a call, each with far-flung promises to see me soon, each gap between the last one and the next a little longer, weaning me away. And in the steady heat of summer, this one or the next, or one of many that would follow, life would rise. During one, the war would end and the soldiers would come home. Over another, I would tend an enormous crop of pumpkins. I would marry like my mother young in another, and in the next would have a baby of my own. They would always end, as summer always does, with a tinge of sadness, and at the far edge of the field, looming tall as a man on horseback, the corn would always grow. Thanks. Yeah.
Where did the inspiration for this story come from?
From the row of stocks. My dad is from Cache Valley, and the family had a farm up there until recently. And I was out, I guess my nieces and nephews one day, and we would go walk around the fields. And there was this row that was the other side of the road, and so it had been missed. And just the image of it, by the time I walked back to the house, I didn't have all the story, but I had that as the central image. So I made these long notes. There's actually on the note paper is actually like receipt tape or something. So there's several feet of notes on this 3-inch wide paper. And then it sat for a year or two. And, but yeah, it was just suggested by the place. So that's where it came from. So in that sense, the corn god was real. Yeah.
Did Adam Young of Owl City get his pun on kissing you between the ears from reading your story?
I have no idea. I hope so. I don't know. Yeah.
How often do you write from a point of view that's very different from your own as a teenager?
Like a 13-year-old girl. It's funny. I actually had to make a change. The editors actually came back to me and asked to make a change to bring that further up front, to add a line because one of the readers didn't realize it was a girl, which I don't know if that says more about my failure to sound like a 13-year-old girl or the fact that they read my name. So we actually added a little more in there. All the time, I suppose. I can't remember what I was reading to try and attempt to get into the mode of a 13-year-old girl. But I don't know that I've written much about all kinds of different areas, I guess, points of view.
The second question then is, what challenges does that present writing from the perspective of
I don't know. Again, I don't know if how successfully I did. There were a few places, and probably even still, where maybe the vocabulary is not right. Although I guess it's being told in retrospect. I don't know. I think I don't have a good answer. I think as the character grew, I knew, like I said, I had the stocks out there, and I knew that there was this confrontation. And then eventually, the next part that came was the line about Afghanistan. So I got her there to the farm, and then I had to get everybody out. And then in a way, just kept inviting people, having them show up until we finally got to a point of conflict. So again, I don't know that that's a very good answer, but that's kind of how it came together. Yeah. Typically just writing another scene, just starting over, not starting over, but just start something new. I'm working on a piece right now that I've been trying to finish for about, I don't know, a couple of months. And the story's done. I mean, everything's happened that's going to happen. And it's kind of, but there's, somehow the ending is not, whether it's the denouement or whatever, there needs to be something there needs to be an end. I guess I could just stop it. So I just keep rewriting endings. Just keep, try this. I've got pages of them now and still haven't gotten there. So that's what I will typically do, is just step out and try and write a whole new scene. I'll give them something else to do, something new to do. Whether it stays in or goes out. I don't know. I can't. There were things. There were things cut from this story. I don't know if there are any huge events, but a lot of little details and such, as I try to build the world of, okay, what were they like after school? What were the logistical problems of having girls meet at a house in the country where blocks are a mile wide? I've finally just kind of ignored those, but again, usually just writing a new scene. There, I've repeated myself 3 times, so yeah, that's my. Yeah.
Adopting an outside perspective as if you hadn't written the piece, what kind of criticism would you apply to the piece?
Wow. I don't know. Some of the criticism I dealt with, the green lines that are in that copy that I've changed. I don't know. I mean, it could be. I mean, certainly. I don't have a good answer to that. I don't know if I've ever thought of it before. I don't know if I can distance myself that far from it. It'd be useful to be able to. But yeah, I don't know. I'll leave that to you. Tell me your criticism. Yeah.
Why did you write this particular story?
I didn't for a while. I think I wrote it because just the power of the suggestion, and the fact that I came away from this experience with this scene in my head, and probably also just the power of the place. I mean, I've written stories before that were just suggested by a place, and I think so. It just goes back to the first image. I knew I had this image, which for some reason just really struck me when I saw the stalks, and I knew that it had this potential. And like I said, I stayed away from it for a little while, but it was just, I thought that I might be able to do something good with it and something powerful with it. And so I finally came back and sat down and wrote it. But it was just this, having that image there. Yeah.
One other question. Why do you write fiction? I mean, what's the pleasure or the satisfaction of keeping? I mean, you're writing now for, I don't know how many years, 130, I guess. But what's
Since I was 7.
the satisfaction?
Oh, the satisfaction.
Why keep at it? You want money to
Yeah, I know. No, it was funny. When I first started doing magazine work, nonfiction, I got this assignment, and it was kind of the first story kind of laid out for me, and here are the people you contact, and it needs to be this long. You work at it for 3 weeks, and then it's done, and they send you money. This is cool, you know. It's nothing like fiction at all, you know. You actually finish something, and you're done. There's just nothing better than, and it seems kind of selfish sometimes, but just to create something, to just bring something into existence that wasn't there. And for me, a lot of it's about the words as well. I like playing with words. My style's changed some over the years, but I think it's just that, the fact that you write something and that you come back to a little later and wonder where that came from, and just bringing something into existence with words. Just like it. Yeah. The ideal response, I think for me, would be the one that I have when I read something amazing, and that is that they just stop. You just, at the end of it, you just have to stop for a minute, and you're absorbed in that. And there's a scene from Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping where she describes a train going over a trestle like a weasel off a rock. It's really amazing. I remember where I was when I read that. And I remember just kind of the overwhelming, power of reading, like Toni Morrison's Beloved, and just being kind of blown away. And just to have the impact. If I try to say something with the story, it doesn't come off very well. I can do it, but it becomes very obvious. And I think the best stories work well within themselves, but you don't always know why. All the actions fit, and they might add up to a number of different things. So I just want them, I guess, to be entertained. I want them to go, wow, at the end of it, and just not think anything for a few minutes, and that would be good. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to move up so I can hear you. The strength of setting, I think it's actually, I'll come back down here, so I tend to mumble.
Repeat the question.
She was saying that the setting is almost becomes a character in that story, which I hadn't really thought about, and asked if it's common. Actually, I've been called out for kind of lack of setting and place sometimes in my writing, and so it's not always a strength. I think for this one, in part, because the actual place has, I'm going to sound kind of academic right now, but I guess it has, I think, some mythic value to my family that's kind of grown as we've gotten older, and the next generation has come up to the farm, and it's not a working farm, it's just a house and fields, and we just go tromp around. But somehow, and I'm wondering, I hadn't thought of it before, but I think in this piece it is, just because I know the place so well. And so it's, and I guess in a way it has to be too, with the corn god as playing a role. So, but typically it's something I would like to achieve, but no, it's sometimes a weak point in my setting. Anything else? Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me down. I really appreciate it. It's been a while. It's been fun.